Thank you, Allison and the Autism Science Foundation for inviting me to speak about this very critical and particularly timely issue. So timely, I can't even guarantee that some of the information I'm about to present won't be outdated by the time I finish in 12 minutes. See if we can get my slides here. Oop. There we are. So it would not be inaccurate to say that adults with autism and other forms of intellectual and developmental disabilities are facing a housing crisis. So I wanted to throw up some statistics just to illustrate the dimension of this crisis. As of 2011, almost 270,000 adults with IDD were on waiting lists for residential services across the country. As of 2013, more than 860,000 adults with IDD lived with caregivers over 60, so facing aging parents who, of course, won't be able to care for them forever. 500,000 autistic children will age into adult services over the next 10 years. And of course, that doesn't include children with other types of intellectual and developmental disabilities like Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. And between 2010, 2013, the growth of residential services has been relatively minuscule, increasing by only about 11,500 adults with IDD per year. So currently, adults with autism and other forms of IDD have several residential options. There is the family home, which is by far the most common placement. About 75% of adults with intellectual disabilities still live at home. There's adult foster care, which is in some states known under the euphemism of shared living, which basically works like the foster system with children, where an adult with a developmental disability is placed with another family. The family is compensated as little as $10,000 a year. It can be up to $25,000 a year, and the hope, of course, is that the family will embrace the disabled individual, make them part of the family, but there's very little oversight to make sure that occurs. And furthermore, this is not a good model for adults with more serious disabilities who might require more services and supports. Dispersed apartments and group homes in the greater community has become the most popular setting for many adult self-advocates and policymakers who push a fully included model. And then there's congregate settings, which have come to mean in some states anything larger than 4 or 6 unrelated individuals in one residential setting. But there's many options, so it seems like everybody should be able to find something that works for them. Except that congregate settings have been ruled out by many states. They're no longer a choice as self-advocates and many policymakers push for dispersed, fully included settings as the only option. These advocates cite the final rule issued by the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, otherwise known as CMS, which was issued in 2014 to support their case for full inclusion. So what does the final rule actually say? Well, it takes almost 60 slides to explain this rule, so we're not going to do that in 12 minutes. But you can see the entire presentation on the Medicaid.gov website. But here are the highlights. HCBS requirements ensures an individual's right of privacy, dignity, respect, and freedom from coercion and restraint, optimizes individual initiative, autonomy, and independence in making life choices, facilitates individual choice regarding services and supports and who provides them. So it seems like CMS is promoting the idea of choice in residential settings here, which is perfect. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. In fact, this is from CMS's own fact sheet. In this final rule, CMS is moving away from defining home and community-based settings by what they are not and toward defining them by the nature and quality of individuals' experiences. The home and community-based setting provisions in this final rule establish a more outcome-oriented definition of home and community-based settings rather than one based solely on a setting's location, geography, or physical characteristics. So the final rule was celebrated by many people with disabilities, their families, providers, and advocates, because after a 5-year period during which CMS had released several drafts of the final rule that attempted to put numbers on community, for example, how many disabled people could live together, or how close they were permitted to live to one another, CMS had seemingly realized that what matters is the quality of a setting and not its size or location. The final rule, as written, was very consistent with previous documents like the ADA and the Supreme Court's Olmstead decision. Although these are both often cited as inclusion mandates, it's very important to note that these are more accurately described as choice mandates. Here are some quotes from Olmstead. States are required to provide integrated settings when community placement is appropriate and the transfer to a less restrictive setting is not opposed by the affected individual. And then I love this quote from Justice Kennedy, who wrote in the concurring opinion to Olmstead, "It would be unreasonable, it would be a tragic event then, were the Americans with Disabilities Act to be interpreted so that states had some incentive for fear of litigation to drive those in need of medical care and treatment out of appropriate care and into settings with too little assistance and supervision." Because this is exactly what's happening right now. What happened after the final rule was issued was that CMS charged the states with drafting transition plans that would bring their regulations in line with the final rule. To help them, CMS released guidance in which they seemed to forget about not focusing on the physical characteristics of settings and called out several specific settings as isolating: farmsteads, disability-specific communities, gated communities, intentional communities, clustered group homes, and campuses. Now, unlike the final rule, CMS solicited no feedback or public comment about the guidance, and yet the guidance has driven states to make very restrictive residential policies. Here in New York, future residential settings will be limited to 4 people, according to your last state transition plan. The focus of your disability organization has shifted to programs that keep autistic adults at home. This is also the focus in Pennsylvania. Our new housing is limited to 3, and all residential settings must be fully integrated. In New Jersey, the original STP set a 4-person limit and a 25% density restriction, which meant any apartment building or complex could only 25% of the units could serve people with waivers. And the question is, so how is everybody doing in their small group homes out in the community? Recent group home exposés in New York and Chicago show that, unsurprisingly, abuse and neglect occur in settings of every size. More than 1,200 developmentally disabled individuals died of unnatural or unknown causes in New York group homes alone over a 10-year period, according to the New York Times. And an investigation into Chicago group homes by the Chicago Tribune identified more than 1,300 cases of documented harm since July 2011, including 42 deaths directly attributed to abuse or neglect in 7 years. It's important to note that research doesn't support the position that quality of life is somehow inversely proportional to size of residential settings. I'll also note that the research in the field of adult services is profoundly flawed in many cases. Some studies fail to distinguish between different types of larger settings, which would put a state institution in the same category, for example, as a bucolic Camp Hill farm community. Others do not properly account for the impact severity of disability has on virtually every variable that these studies measure, including the ability to make choices, ability to access the greater community, and overall quality of life. So more research is definitely needed. But these are 2 studies, one Irish study that found that larger settings had greater levels of social inclusion, and another study that intentional communities for adults with IDD offered greater social networks and other more activities, and found that village communities and dispersed housing scored equivalently on indicators such as choice making and satisfaction. Fact is, intentional communities are very popular with autistic adults and their families. They're going up all over the country. These are just some images and names of places that are going up in Florida, in Virginia, one's in California, in Texas. In some states, people with waivers can use their money to pay for them, but in other states, these residences are only available to those who can private pay. I wanted to make sure you guys understood that advocacy does work. New Jersey and Pennsylvania both recently proposed policies requiring waiver recipients in day programs to spend 75% of their time in the community, which would effectively close sheltered workshops. This may not seem relevant to housing policy, but the same push against disability-specific residential settings drives policies targeting disability-specific vocational settings. Both limits were substantially dropped due to pressure and outrage from adults with disabilities, their families, providers, and legislators. And I want to say that legislators in particular are tremendous allies in this fight, because all we're arguing is a common sense argument that people with disabilities should be able to make the same choices that people without disabilities have. And a lot of times legislators are shocked that this is an issue. So I encourage everybody to make sure they continue to recruit their legislators, because they can all connect to an argument like, who shouldn't our parents be allowed to live in gated retirement communities? Or our children could live in college dormitories? Are these settings isolating and segregating? Plus, it seems as if we may have a new champion in this fight. Not who you were expecting, huh? I do want to say with a caveat, a huge caveat, that there's no doubt that if Trump succeeds in block granting Medicaid, a proposal that at least temporarily went down with the American Health Care Act, that would be disastrous for the entire disability community, likely leading to huge cuts in services. But the Trump administration does seem to be more sympathetic to the choice issue than the Obama administration. On March 14th, Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price and CMS Administrator Seema Verma issued a letter to the governors concerning upcoming changes to Medicaid. They promised to, quote, work toward providing additional time for states to comply with the final rule. So basically, they pushed off indefinitely implementation of the settings rule from CMS, and they also want to examine ways in which we can improve our engagement with states on the implementation of the final rule. So it looks like what CMS wants to do under the new administration is kind of just let the states handle it however they want to, which would be really beneficial for our cause. We would still have to fight with some very inclusion-minded state policymakers, but they would no longer have the argument that CMS is making them do it. I don't want to end with Donald Trump, so I'm going to end with my son Jonah, who deserves the same freedoms everyone in this room has to choose where and with whom we live. Or if he never develops the capacity to make those kind of decisions, that we as his parents have the freedom to make the choices that will maximize his quality of life. This issue has become a huge civil rights issue in the autism and IDD communities, and our efforts right now to educate, to advocate, to design, to build will impact not only our children's lives now, but the lives of the generations of developmentally disabled that will follow. Thank you.